So this is a pretty good overview of the most famous styles. Let's dig deeper into the four major styles in green, then we can see where Varasanos pizza fits in. Pizza more or less evolved this way. It started in Naples, it went to the first round of 8 or so New York elite pizzerias, then on to the thousands of New York street pizzerias, and finally to the American chains. Obviously, some detours along the way, but this is a pretty fair summary, especially if we're talking about kind of a traditional tomato, cheese, comparatively thin crust pizza compared, for example, to Chicago style. This is the main line of evolution of pizza in America. Now, along the way, there were changes to the oven, to the dough, to the sauce, to the cheese, to the toppings, etc. Some changes were improvements, but in general, the change was towards cheaper, towards a lower quality. So where are we at Varasanos? Well, we are in the blue. Now notice that we are not all on the Neapolitan side. I'm not one of these guys that's like, oh, our pizza has got to be 100% authentic Neapolitan. The problem with that is that it's kind of static. Like, I know a lot of pizzerias that are trying to be 100% authentically Neapolitan. But if I test an olive oil and let's say it's from Morocco and I like it better than the one that comes from Italy, well, can I use it if my claim is that I'm, quote, authentically Neapolitan? Being authentic is kind of like being trapped into someone else's style. So I prefer to experiment and do whatever I think improves quality. Also, I don't make the mistake of thinking that expensive is always better. You know, filet mignon is more expensive than ground chuck, but you can make a great burger with chuck. It's kind of the same here. Look, for example, at how the cheese evolved. It started with mozzarella di bufala, often going from milk to pizza in one day. In America, the first pizzerias, they didn't have bufala herds in America, so they would have had to import the bufala cheese from Italy, which would have been prohibitively expensive. So instead, they switched to cow's milk. Then they switched again, and they used a dried aged cheese. Now, I've seen some amazing pizzas that use dry mozzarella. So going cheaper is not always bad. It's not about the pretension of it. You know, when you dry the cheese and you age it just a little bit, it actually does tend to have a bit more flavor. It doesn't have maybe that bright freshness, not the bright milkiness that you get in a fresh cheese. But by aging it, you know, we judge some of our cheeses by how long they're aged. And some cheeses are better aged, they're aged 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. So aging the cheese and drying out is not necessarily worse. It is a little bit different. So it's not about the pretension of saying, oh, I have to use this because it's more authentic or it's more expensive. However, having said that, of course, on the other side, if you've gone a little bit cheaper on the oven and the dough and the sauce and the cheese and the meats, well, pretty soon you're descending into junk food. Some changes are, hey, I just prefer the cheaper one because I taste tested it and I like the less expensive one. Other changes, of course, are I prefer this one because it's cheaper. And that's where the devolution of pizza kind of comes in. Along the same lines, if I've gotten rid of the cheese and I've put in chicken, and I've taken out the tomato sauce and I've put in barbecue sauce, you know, I don't know. Is that still pizza? You know, at some point of evolution or some point of drift, don't we just need a new name for the food? Can't we just call it something else? I mean, if we switch the dough with a pita, is that still pizza? What about to a boboli crust? I've gotten into some trouble giving my strong opinion that this or that is just not pizza anymore. But my thing is, I want to stay true to the theme of the Neapolitan pizza. I want to stay true to the style. I want to use Mediterranean type ingredients. You know, for example, when we get to our dolce pizza, in a few minutes we're going to talk about each individual pizza, and we get to our dessert pizza. Well, I've seen people make dessert pizza with, you know, blueberries and whipped cream. You know, to me, that's not really pizza anymore. I don't object to the idea of having a sweeter pizza, but at some point, you know, it's not really pizza anymore. Our sweet pizza contains all these ingredients that are found in and around Italy and the Mediterranean area: dates and honey and nuts and European cheeses. So it still kind of has that European, that Italian flavor. And in that sense, I do consider it still pizza. I hope that's clear. It's kind of a matter of opinion, but at the same point in time, there is something objective about it also. So my thing is that I just want to make an awesome pizza. I want to have a great crust. I want to have a great mouthfeel. Let's get into the evolution of these styles. First, let me show you a sample of each one. With the Neapolitan, you can see that the dough is spotted. This is called leoparding. Rather than brown or beige, the crust is just black and white. This is a sign of a super hot oven. Also, you can see that the cheese is very white, very milky, and spread sporadically over the pie. The sauce is bright red. The next style is the New York Elite. It's similar, but with a little more brown on the crust. That's because the temperature has dropped just a little bit. The cheese is melted a little more evenly as well. Next, we have the New York Street Pizza. Now you can see the pie is really starting to look different, mostly because the cheese is much more yellow and it forms a more even layer over it. But also, the crust is more brown or beige and is not really spotted so much anymore. The sauce is still reddish, but it's not quite as bright of a red. And then finally, when we get to the next one here, we get to the chain pizza. The crust is really totally beige at this point. The cheese is very clearly just yellow and pre-shredded. You can see the little tiny pieces over the crust. That look actually is kind of sort of interesting. I think people intuitively understand that the crust should have a little bit of spotting. That spotting used to come from the heat in order to mimic some of that color where the crust has a little bit of beige and a little bit of a darker color on it, rather than get that by actually heating the crust up and getting that effect in the dough itself. They simply shred some of the cheese and it gets dripped over the edge, and that is what changes color and makes it look spotted. So that's really a sign for people that know, that have looked at a lot of pizzas, of kind of a cheap shortcut, I hate to say. And then the sauce is almost entirely brown. There's really not much of a red essence to it at all. Now let's look at the first one and the last one side by side, where the changes are going to be, of course, most dramatic. Okay, so let's see what happened here. How did we get from point A to point B? Let's start with the oven. The thing that everyone likes to focus on with the oven is the fuel. We went from wood-fired to coal to gas decks and eventually to convection ovens. Everyone thinks that the fuel adds a smoky flavor, and therefore they think that it's super important to use just the right kind of wood or coal. Well, there is a small difference in flavor. There is a little bit of smokiness that can be imparted by that fuel. But mostly, the pizza is not baked that long and doesn't pick up that much smoky flavor, even in these solid fuel burning ovens. If you ever watch wood burn, you'll realize that most of the smokiness occurs when wood or coal is heating up. Once it gets really hot and turns to embers, there's really not that much smoke produced anymore. And there's also a little bit of physics involved, which I don't want to get into, but the easiest way to think about it is the faster that it bakes, the less time there really is for any smoke that might be circulating there to really flavor the crust that much. The main difference in these ovens really is the temp and the time it takes to bake. You can see that as we progress, the oven just gets cooler and cooler, going from 900 down to 550, and conversely, you can see that the time it bakes a pie goes from under a minute up to 10, 12, 15 minutes. Now, that's a huge, huge, huge difference. The color difference you see are mostly because of this temperature difference, not really because of the fuel. Temp really just affects how the dough bakes and really also affects how thick the pizza is. A thin pizza would just dry out at a low temp. So in order to keep that from happening, the dough is just made a little bit thicker so that more of the moisture is buried inside the thickness of the dough, and more oil is added also. So both of these things, making it thicker and adding oil to the dough, keep it moist even as it's sitting in this dry oven for long periods of time. The advantage of going to a low temp is that it's just easier to handle. There's just less skill needed with a cool oven. By the time you get down to the convection oven, you've more or less given up on the idea of creating any char on the bottom of the pie, in favor of having an oven that's so easy that you can just put a pan through a convection on one side, and when it comes out the other side, it's done. So you really have an assembly line, and that's what makes it so much less expensive. On the flip side, when you're dealing with these ovens that are 900 degrees that can burn a pie in just a couple of seconds of inattention, you really need guys that have trained for long periods of time. So it really does go from much more expensive and much more skilled to much less expensive, much less skilled. Frankly, when you're dealing with the convection oven, you don't even have to pay anybody to watch the pizza. When it comes out, it's done. Whereas the Neapolitan oven, there has to be a guy you have to pay that's standing there the whole time flipping it around. You can see that we are at about 2 to 4 minute pizzas. Now, any hotter, frankly, and the pizza comes out super wet and will get soggy really fast. Some of the pizzas I had in Naples were singed on the outside, but inside the dough was almost still raw. I really like it right about here. Also, and this has to do with the way that the customers in our particular market eat the pizza, we really do need to slow down the bake just a little bit. The softer, the doughier pies that were made in Naples, these were eaten standing up. They came out, they were handed to somebody, they ate the pizza right away. They weren't put on a plate and they didn't sit for 20 minutes while people had conversations. With the southern way of doing things, people eat the pies very, very slowly, and so the fast bake would leave the pie to lose its crispness and become soggy very fast. We even have a little bit of that problem here in the 2 to 4 minute range, which is one of the reasons we put out the cards and tell people to eat the pizza now and to fold it, pick it up off the plate, because that maintains a little bit of the crispness. Well, so we're trying to stay a little bit true to the Neapolitan, but we've had to make some compromise, not so much for the quality, but for a realization of the way that our customers eat the pizza. Next, we have the dough. A lot has been made of the flour, but the truth is that most flours sold are very good. We just have high quality farming methods, and bad flour is just not that common anymore. We use a blend that is both what the Neapolitan guys use and the New York Elite guys use. As the pizza evolved, you can see they moved towards ever higher gluten flours. It's got more protein. It's kind of a cheat. Now, the protein, which is called gluten, is what gives bread its structure. It's what allows bread to have big, airy holes. The more gluten you have, the lighter that you can get the dough. Without it, you end up with dense breads like rye bread or whole wheat breads, etc. But while more protein makes it easier to be lighter looking, it actually can also make it heavy in your stomach. It's one of those things that just sits like a brick in your stomach when you've eaten a cheap pizza. Now, you can get a crust just as light without having high gluten, but again, it's more skill and cost. You have to really know how to mix and proof and age, and even how to gently spread the dough. The big cheat that goes on as you move to the right is the dough additives. The ingredient list on our flour is wheat. That's it. As you go right, you start seeing a longer and longer list of ingredients. You start seeing things like potassium bromate. Now, potassium bromate is an oxidant which is banned through Europe as possibly being a carcinogen. So while we all see foods promoting the fact that they have antioxidants, potassium bromate is added to most pizza doughs, which is straight up an oxidant. By the time you get over here, even in addition to the oxidants, it's like reading the chemical list on a batch of Twinkies, frankly. I don't even know what half of these things are for, but you can be sure that there's a bunch of guys in lab coats looking for additives. They're going to do all kinds of things. They're going to make the dough easier to freeze. They're going to make it last longer in the fridge. They're going to make it bake so that it stays less mushy if it's sitting in a pizza delivery bag for an hour, etc. All of these additives are solving specific problems in production, but they don't really have anything to do with taste. They're not adding them because they improve the quality of the pizza. It's really improving something to do with production or cost. For example, if I can add an additive to my dough that will help it be revived from a freezing process better, well, then I don't have to make the dough in the store anymore. I can make it in some big factory using big machines that are, way, way cheaper than mixing dough by hand. So, of course, this is a great example of the devolution of pizza towards production cost as being the primary factor in driving decisions and not quality anymore. Next here, we use a natural starter for our yeast. Now, a natural starter means that we have a yeast culture that is just continually fed. It's like having a garden. It's like when I did my herbs, I had plants in my front yard, and then I'd get seeds, and the next year I'd plant the seeds again. So it was continuously alive. This is, of course, the way that breads used to be made years ago. But now, in the last 100 years or so, they've developed commercial yeasts that don't keep going year after year after year, but they have the advantage that you can buy a commercial and industrial product that's going to be exactly the same every day. It's not temperamental in the way that sometimes a natural starter is. Our natural starter has to be fed every night, and if someone forgets to feed it or if it's left out a little bit too warm, it can really vary the pizza quality. Other places eliminate all of those problems for themselves by just going and buying a commercial product. How hard is it to work with? Well, there's probably 5 pizzerias in the country that are doing it this way. Even in Naples, most of the pizzerias remaining don't do it this way anymore. What's the problem with using the commercial yeast that these guys are using? Well, of course, when they went to a more consistent product, they had to sacrifice something, and that sacrifice was flavor. So they're using an instant product which proofs and rises very predictably, but really is quite bland. By the time you get all the way over here, the yeast is actually being boosted with chemical leavening agents and all kinds of stuff. Now, I'm not going to go through this line by line. If you want to pause and take a look, you're certainly welcome to. But you can see that originally the dough was fermented slowly, gently hand-flipped, topped with San Marzano tomatoes, fresh herbs, extra virgin olive oil, fresh buffalo mozzarella, and quality cured meats. Over here on the other side, we see quickly risen instant doughs, roughly pressed into shape, often by machine, which punches out all the light airiness in the dough. They're topped with super sweet, round American tomatoes, often with sugar added on top of the sweetness of the tomatoes, flavor packs thrown in, some even with MSG and trans fats. Instead of Parmesan cut from a wheel, we see pre-grated bottles of who knows what. You know, originally in Italy, every town had its own version of some aged salumi, and by the time we got here to America, that was abbreviated down to just one, pepperoni. And by the time we get over here, we've got who knows what in the Meatloaf Supreme. So I'm just trying to give you some perspective on where we are. We are clearly not 100% Neapolitan. We're not that far off, but we're not 100% Neapolitan. The big thing to understand is that we make a super light pie out of the highest quality ingredients that we can find. We use really the most difficult old school processes, especially in our dough, and that our goal is really to create a world-class pizza that has great flavor, that has fresh ingredients, that is going to have a great feel in the mouth, that's slightly charred all around the edges, very close to the Neapolitan standard, but always with the emphasis on taste, not necessarily authenticity, but just on quality.